everyone, and welcome to one of the last lectures in INDS130 for this semester. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and elders past and present. I'll be brief today because I know that many of you have a lot of assignments and things to get finished before the end of semester. My name is Nolene Lumby and I teach at the Bega campus of the University of Wollongong. So today we'll begin with what is meant by Indigenous knowledge systems in the curriculum. We'll touch on a bit of theory in relation to that. We'll look at some examples in both Australia and Canada and compare different ways of learning through the lens of Indigenous people and their understanding of what Indigenous knowledge in the curriculum means for them. And we'll finish today with a look at some Indigenous students who are talking about culture, understanding of themselves as Indigenous students in the education system that we have. Okay, let's get started. What is Indigenous knowledge in the curriculum? We'll have a look at New South Wales and also have a look at some First Nations ideas on this. And we may even look at a few different resources that are available across the other education systems in Australia. So what does it mean? The New South Wales Aboriginal Education and Training Strategy has a goal to have Aboriginal knowledge, cultural values and practices embedded within curriculum frameworks and delivery of education and training. This next slide I wanted to show you shows in particular, it's from Western Australia, and it shows how Indigenous perspectives can be embedded within a science curriculum. It has some really great ideas for people to use, but it doesn't give you the complete understanding of how knowledge is needed and necessary in understanding Aboriginal culture. We might just have a look at some of the words that we need to know about within this, and I know we've looked at epistemology before, and epistemology is the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to its methods, validity, and scope, and the distinction between justified belief and opinion. Now this is really important for us. We're looking at Aboriginal knowledge systems or Indigenous knowledge systems. Marie Baptiste, and she is a educator in Canada. She says knowledge is a process derived from creation, and as such, it has a sacred purpose. It is inherent in and connected to all of nature, to its creatures and to its humans' existence. And this is important when you're trying to understand how Indigenous knowledge works within the education system and within the curriculum also. She also states that knowledge is a resourceful capacity of being that creates the context and texture for life. It's real life experiences for students. It's not just bits and pieces and subjects broken up into different areas. It's the holistic view of life and of learning. And it's the National Aboriginal Education Committee in 1995, it's a while ago, but it's still something that's pertinent to what's happening nowadays. So only when this occurs will education for our people be a process that builds upon Aboriginal and Torres Strait cultures and identity. So you can see that the same sorts of issues are happening and the same sorts of developments are happening both in the Australian context and the Canadian context. And I think it's important that the focus has to be rather on how rather than what when you're teaching through culture, and using Aboriginal processes and protocols and not just Aboriginal content. So how do we get to this point where Indigenous knowledge systems are recognised and valued and used within the education system in which children is taught today? Dr. Martin Nakada, in his book Disciplining the Savages and Savaging the Disciplines, explores the intersection of Western knowledge systems and the Torres Strait Island position and experiences. I recommend that you read this book, especially for any education students. Also, there have been other Indigenous people in Australia who have worked on this cultural space, the space where people can share their knowledges, and it's not just one or the other, and value both types of knowledge. Barber and Yunupingu in 1989 and 2004 state that the third cultural space process draws on the rich Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, perspectives, ways of knowing, being and doing, balanced symbiotically alongside Western ways of knowing, being and doing. The middle ground, or the third cultural space, represents a new way of working, and I'd have to say that's a very rich way of working. And you can somewhat argue that focusing on similarities between the two systems of knowledge rather than on their differences may be a very useful place to start when considering how best to introduce Indigenous knowledge systems within the curriculum. Following on from Martin Nakata's work, Tyson Yunkaporta developed a similar diagram within the Aboriginal 8 Ways of Learning framework. This framework, or this way of knowing, is being used extensively across Western New South Wales and I know in Southwest Sydney as well, in schools with populations of Aboriginal students and in schools where this type of knowledge system works better for students to learn. I suppose the big thing in this is how do we bridge the gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal knowledge, and the boomerang depicts a meeting or sharing of both cultures in the educational setting, and thereby developing knowledge, deeper understanding and valuing both ways of knowing. So what happens in this cultural interface, this space where there's shared learning between Indigenous and Western cultural knowledge? Yunkaporta states that there are some areas that are shared, the commonalities. One, learning through narrative, planning and visualising explicit processes, working non-verbally with self-reflective hands-on methods, learning through images, symbols and metaphors, learning through place-responsive environmental practice, using indirect, innovative and interdisciplinary approaches, modelling and scaffolding by working from wholes to part and connecting learning to local values, needs and knowledge. And this is what it looks like. This is Yunkaporta's dynamic framework for these common ground pedagogies. So we're going to take a little bit of time to have a look at each of these symbols and explore exactly what they mean. And in some instances we'll have some examples of how they work and the Indigenous knowledge which is embedded into each of them. Also remembering that all Indigenous knowledge is related to the country or the land in which it is learnt on. So it's very, very important and vital that your local community and Indigenous people are involved in the process of developing educational lessons for students to use in their area. So the first area of commonality we're going to look at is learning maps. I'm not going to look at them in any specific order because, as you can see by the framework, they all interconnect. Okay, learning maps. Images or visualizations are used to map out processes for learners to follow. Hughes and Moore state that in the optimal Aboriginal pedagogy, the teacher and the learner create a concrete, holistic image of the task to be performed, and that image serves as an anchor or reference point for the learner. Aboriginal people in the Central Desert have used the earth to convey messages and to show images and visualizations and to use them as maps for centuries, or thousands of years I should say. I've just got a little clip here for you to see of a young girl who has learnt some of these skills from her grandmother as the skills are passed on and shared.
Hi, my name is Ancina and I'm showing you the track that my nana showed me when I was little, and this is a Toyota track. The Toyota. This is Toyota's track, and then you go like that and you put it down and then you go like that, so you can make it like Toyota track. And this is making, you go like that and you put hand like that and then you go like that, it's like that, and you hold like that and then you put it like that. It's like you're making little baby's foot like that, like little baby's foot. That's a little baby was walking. you hold it like that, and you put your hand down on the, and then you go like that too, like you make a baby's hand. And this is this is how you do it. This is a kangaroo. You do it like that with your hand, and you go like that to make it like kangaroo's foot, like that. I'll just do another one like that. And this is bullock, like bullock or donkey, I don't know. You just go like that, and then you go in, and you go like that, do it, like bullocks or donkey's foot. And this is snake. You just go like that. You put your hand, and you just do it like that. Make it like snake. And that's all I got.
The next area we're going to look at is holistic, global, scaffolded and independent learning orientations of Aboriginal students. Harris states that Aboriginal pedagogy is about learning wholes rather than parts, and that really is not in line with Western education systems. Aboriginal students begin with the whole structure rather than a series of sequenced steps. And they also state that Aboriginal learners concentrate on understanding the overall concept or the task before getting down to the details. So pretty much, why are we doing this? This next area in the framework discusses Aboriginal pedagogy as being group-oriented, localised and connected to real-life purposes and contexts. The motivation for learning in Aboriginal pedagogy is your inclusion in your community. And Aboriginal teaching refers to community life and values. This is really evident in many of these stories that are told. I'm going to play for you a story by Arnie Fran Bodkin, and I'd like you to listen carefully as you'll be asked to discuss this further in your tutorial. What are the main ideas and values embedded in the story? That's what I'd like you to note down to take back to your class.
This is the story of Watanguri, the story of the hairy men, or how the Bankses came to be. A very long time ago there lived in this land two very different kinds of peoples. There were the keepers of this land, the Darawals, and then there were the Watanguri. The Darawals are the people we know today as the Darawals, the Bidigals, the Wongals, all of those groups that lived in this land, the people who lived here when the white man first came here. The Watanguri were the hairy men, and although they were all Kuri, there were two different kinds. The Duliga were the giant hairy men, almost as big as trees, and the Kurija were little hairy men, about the size of a milk carton today. Now everybody lived together peacefully for a very long time. Sometimes as they walked by, the Darawals would wave to the Watanguri, and the women would chatter and exchange gifts, and on very special occasions they will all celebrate together with a big bunya. Of course, at these times the poor little Kurijas would often have to be very careful to keep out of the way of the big dancing feet of the clumsy Duligas. But there came a time when a terrible drought passed over this land. The rivers and waterholes all dried up. Many of the animals died, as did many of the plants and the trees. Because there was no water in the rivers or the creeks, nearly all the fish died. The little Kurija, though, were fine. Because they were so small, they could eat the nectar from the flowers and the honey in the hollow branches of the trees. And as everybody knows, during drought time, there are always plenty of flowers which produce nectar, but they do not produce fruit or seed. The Darawals, instead of eating seeds and fruit, ate the roots and the tubers of the plants, because everybody should know that during drought time, when the plants die down, they always store food in their roots and tubers, ready to help the plant grow again when it rains. But the poor Dooligas were very, very hungry. Because they were so large, they could not find enough food to fill their bellies, and they quickly became too weak to catch any poor kangaroo that did not have the sense to hide or to move away to a place where there was no drought. One day some Dooligas were resting on the ground near their cave when a mob of Darawals came by. The grown-ups were walking along, chattering away and busily prodding the ground looking for juicy roots. But some of the children of the clan, instead of paying attention to their parents' instructions, were straggling along behind, making lots of noise, chasing each other, or running off into the bushes to hide from their friends, even breaking off branches of trees and shrubs and throwing them to the ground. Now, everybody should know that at all times you should be as quiet as possible whilst walking through our bushland. The trees and the bushes, the insects and the animals, even the land will tell you its secrets if you only listen. And of course, most importantly, everyone should know that you must never break off the branches of trees and bushes and throw them on the ground, because it can make bushfires very much worse, particularly during times of drought. One of the Dooligas watched the children playing, and as he watched, his stomach began to rumble and his mouth began to water. He made a sign of silence to his companions, and soundlessly crept down to where some children were hiding from their friends. The Dooliga grabbed the children, burying their faces in his long hair so that their screams could not be heard, and ran to his cave where he promptly ate the fattest one and imprisoned the other so he could eat it later. His companions decided that they too would join the feast, and followed the Darawals until some more children straggled behind, grabbed them, and after eating one, hid the other away in the cave to fatten them up. When they finally got to the camp, the Darawals became very alarmed. They found that some of their children were missing, and although they searched high and low, they could not find them. The only clue they could find was the hair of a Watanguri hanging from a tree branch. The Darawals approached the Kurrajars and asked them if they had seen their children. Of course the Kurrajars had not seen the children, but when they were shown the solitary hair, they began to suspect that it might have been their brothers, the Dooligas, who were responsible. The little Kurrajars went to the Dooliga camp and asked one of the Dooligas if they had seen the Darawal children. The sleepy Dooliga just opened one eye, patted his belly, rolled over, and went back to sleep again. And the little Kurrajars knew then what had happened to some of the Darawal children. Now the little Kurrajars knew where the Dooliga cave was and crept into the dark, scary place. There they found the remaining children too frightened to move, huddled together in the darkest part of the cave, trapped behind a huge rock so they could not escape. The little Kurrajars rescued them, providing light for them to see their way over the big rock and warning them to be silent. They got the children safely out of the cave and took them back to their camp. The Darawal clan were overjoyed at having at least some of their children back, and thanked the little Kurrajars, giving them gifts of many flowers and honey. Pretty soon, though, the children began to forget the lessons they had learned, and once again began to straggle behind the clan as they searched for food, or they would run off into the bushes, hiding from their parents, trying to scare them. Or they would break off the branches of the trees and shrubs and throw them on the ground. And the Dooligas were waiting for them, drooling with anticipation of a nice, juicy meal. One day, as they passed by the Darawal camp, the Kurrajars saw the Darawals putting on their war paint, painting their faces and their bodies, sharpening their spears and their killing sticks, and decorating their shields. The Kurrajars knew that this could only result in war, and when there was war, many innocent people would be killed, and it was usually the smallest people who got hurt first. Now in those days, all Kurrajong trees were hollow, and even during the most severe drought, the Kurrajong always bore plenty of seed high in its branches, and the roots always contained plenty of water. And most importantly, of course, in the hollow branches of the Kurrajong, the native bees built their nests and stored their honey. The Couragers met with the Dooligas and told them of the wonderful Kurrajong tree which provided both food and shelter. The Dooligas followed the little Couragers to the Kurrajongs, where they greedily ate their fill and drank the water from the roots and fell asleep in the hollow of the trunks. And while the Dooligas slept, the little Couragers sealed up the trunks of the trees, leaving only a hollow crack for the Dooligas to breathe. Their brothers were now safe. They could have all the food and water they would need, and the war would be averted. But the Couragers were still worried. What would happen if a strong wind came and blew the trees down, and the Dooligas would be free? Or if lightning struck the trees and split them apart, and the Dooligas would be free? Or maybe someday some foolish man would come along and cut the trees down. The Dooligas would be free, and they would not be happy. So the little Couragers climbed a nearby tree, and there they are today, sitting along the branches, watching over the Kurrajong trees, making sure that the Dooligas trapped inside do not escape. Some of you may have seen them sitting along the branches of the bushes of the trees. Sometimes their eyes are closed as they pretend to be asleep, but sometimes you will see them with their eyes open, and then you must beware, for it means that the Dooligas are awake and trying to escape. Today you call the little hairy men by the name of Banksia, but the Darwals know their real name, Kurraja.